Order! I will have order! You will not disrupt my court! This is a travesty! Take your nonsense and be gone! Out of my court! Isha!
The gavel slammed down with a sharp crack that echoed through the silent courtroom. Judge Calvin Mercer leaned forward from his high bench. His eyes narrowed with open irritation as he stared at the teenage girl standing before him. "Look at me when I'm speaking to you," he barked harshly. His voice carried across the room like thunder, bouncing off the polished wooden walls and marble floor. 17-year-old Aisha Carter slowly lifted her gaze from the floor, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear anything else. She stood at the defendant's table in a modest blue blouse and dark skirt, the nicest clothes she owned. In her hands, she clutched a small spiral notebook so tightly that the edges pressed into her palms. Behind her, the courtroom benches were filled with spectators waiting for their own cases. But now, every pair of eyes had shifted toward her. A few quiet chuckles slipped through the crowd, followed by whispers that spread across the room like ripples in water. Judge Mercer pushed his chair back and stood up abruptly. The sudden movement made several people glance at each other in surprise. Judges rarely stepped down from the bench during a hearing, but Mercer seemed to enjoy doing things his own way. He descended the short wooden steps slowly, his polished shoes clicking loudly on the marble floor as he approached Aisha. The bailiff watched carefully but said nothing. Mercer stopped only a few feet from her, towering over her with a cold expression that made her stomach twist with unease. Without warning, he reached over and snatched the stack of legal documents sitting on the table beside her. He flipped through them quickly, his lips curling into a thin, mocking smile. "Trespassing," he said loudly, making sure everyone in the room could hear him. "At the Royal Crescent Hotel, of all places." He shook his head with exaggerated disappointment. "It seems we have another young person who believes the rules don't apply to them." Before Aisha could even react, Mercer let the papers slip from his hands. They scattered across the floor in every direction, sliding across the polished marble like fallen leaves. A sudden wave of quiet laughter moved through the benches behind her. The judge crossed his arms and tapped the tip of his expensive shoe against the ground impatiently. "Well?" he said, raising an eyebrow. "Pick them up." For a moment, Aisha didn't move. Her face burned with humiliation as she felt the weight of the entire room staring at her. Slowly, she knelt down on the cold marble floor and began gathering the scattered pages. The sound of the rustling papers echoed softly through the courtroom. Her public defender, Mr. Collins, stood beside the table pretending to organize his briefcase, his eyes carefully avoiding hers. He had already warned her earlier that morning not to argue with the judge. "Just keep your head down," he had said quietly. Judge Mercer doesn't like being challenged. Aisha's father, Marcus Carter, sat in the third row behind her. His faded maintenance uniform still smelled faintly of cleaning chemicals from the long shift he had worked before coming to court. His rough hands tightened into fists as he watched his daughter kneeling on the floor, while people laughed under their breath. He shifted slightly in his seat, but the bailiff standing nearby took a step closer, a silent reminder that any outburst would only make things worse. Marcus forced himself to stay quiet, though anger burned in his chest. When Aisha finally finished gathering the papers and stood up again, Judge Mercer had already returned to his bench. He settled back into his chair as if nothing unusual had happened, folding his hands together in front of him. "Remember where you are," he said calmly, his voice dripping with condescension. "This courtroom deserves respect." Aisha said nothing. Instead, she held her notebook close to her chest again. To everyone else, it probably looked like the nervous habit of a frightened teenager. But inside that notebook were pages filled with careful observations she had been writing for weeks. Every time she had sat quietly in this courtroom, waiting for her case to be called, she had watched everything. The judge's tone, the sentences he gave, the way he spoke to certain defendants compared to others. She had written down dates, names, and exact words she remembered hearing. Earlier that morning, before the sun had fully risen, Aisha had stood in the small kitchen of their apartment, adjusting the collar of her blouse, while her father poured 2 cups of cheap instant coffee. "You'll be fine," Marcus had said softly, though worry lined his face. "Just tell the truth. That's all you can do." Aisha had nodded and slipped the notebook into her bag before leaving the apartment. She hadn't told her father exactly what was written inside it. She only knew that if anyone discovered what she had been documenting, things could become much more complicated. At the courthouse, Mr. Collins had met them in the hallway while flipping through a stack of files. "Aisha Carter?" he asked distractedly. "Right, the hotel trespassing case." He sighed and lowered his voice. "Listen, my advice is simple. Accept the plea deal, a fine and some community service. It's better than pushing your luck with Mercer." "But I didn't trespass," Aisha had tried to explain. "I was invited there for—" Collins had already shaken his head. "That's not the point," he interrupted. "Mercer doesn't like excuses." Now, standing in the courtroom as the judge looked down at her again with thinly disguised irritation, Aisha felt the weight of the moment pressing on her shoulders. Around her, the spectators shifted in their seats, whispering quietly as they waited to see what would happen next. Judge Mercer glanced at the file in front of him and sighed dramatically. "Another case of someone wandering into a place they clearly don't belong," he muttered. Aisha's grip tightened slightly on the notebook. None of the people watching realized that the quiet girl, standing at the defendant's table, had been paying attention far more carefully than anyone expected. And inside the small spiral notebook pressed against her chest were the observations that could one day turn this entire courtroom upside down. When the courtroom settled again, Judge Calvin Mercer flipped through the documents in front of him with exaggerated boredom, as if Aisha Carter's case was nothing more than an inconvenience interrupting his day. Adjusting his glasses, he slowly read from the file and announced her charge of trespassing at the Royal Crescent Hotel, emphasizing that it was a luxury 5-star establishment and not the kind of place someone could simply wander into by accident. A few quiet chuckles moved through the courtroom benches as his sarcastic tone made it clear he already doubted her. Aisha stood still at the defendant's table, her modest blue blouse and worn shoes drawing silent judgment from the spectators. Yet she kept her eyes forward and refused to react. Her lawyer, Mr. Collins, nervously attempted to explain that there might have been a misunderstanding and that Aisha insisted she had been invited to the hotel for a legitimate reason. But Mercer cut him off sharply before he could finish. The judge explained that security had found her inside a restricted section near executive conference rooms where expensive equipment was kept, places ordinary guests were not allowed to enter. Before she could stop herself, Aisha quietly spoke up and said she hadn't been wandering. The courtroom instantly fell silent. Mercer lifted his eyes slowly and asked in a low, irritated voice if he had given her permission to speak. She swallowed, admitted he had not, and the judge snapped that this was a courtroom, not a classroom, and that her lawyer would speak for her. Mr. Collins awkwardly suggested that perhaps a fine and community service would be enough for a first offense, but Mercer corrected him immediately, pointing out a previous citation from the year before when Aisha had been found in Riverside Park after closing hours. Aisha explained softly that she had been studying there because the electricity in her apartment had gone out and the park lights were the only place she could read. Mercer raised his eyebrows with mock sympathy and replied dryly that it was touching. She studied under street lamps, but rules still applied to everyone. Behind her, her father Marcus shifted uneasily in his seat, while the bailiff watched him carefully. While the judge continued speaking, Aisha quietly opened the small spiral notebook she carried and began writing again, noting the exact words Mercer used and the reactions in the room. Earlier that morning, she had already filled pages while observing other cases. A white teenager caught shoplifting had received only a warning and minimal community service. Another boy accused of vandalism had his fine reduced after his father spoke to the judge, yet a young boy from a poor neighborhood had been given the maximum punishment for loitering. Aisha had written every detail down, carefully documenting the patterns she noticed. As her pen moved across the page again, Mercer suddenly stopped speaking mid-sentence and demanded to know what she was writing. When she replied that they were just notes, his annoyance grew, and he ordered her to hand the notebook over. After a brief hesitation, she passed it to the bailiff, who carried it to the bench. At first, Mercer flipped through it casually, but as he read further, his expression shifted slightly. The pages contained detailed observations, dates, case numbers, sentencing outcomes, even quotes from the judge himself, along with small comparisons showing how different defendants were treated. For a moment, his jaw tightened, but he quickly shut the notebook and tossed it back toward the table with forced amusement, remarking sarcastically that she seemed to be quite the little researcher. Some people laughed again, thinking it was a joke. Mercer leaned back and told her that writing things down would not change the facts of her case, insisting she had been found somewhere she clearly did not belong. Then he tapped the gavel lightly and ordered her to step into the center of the courtroom. Even her lawyer looked confused by the unusual request, but he said nothing. Aisha walked slowly across the polished marble floor while dozens of eyes followed her. When she stopped where the judge indicated, Mercer leaned forward and loudly asked her to explain to everyone why she believed she had any reason to be inside a luxury hotel like the Royal Crescent. Aisha lifted her chin slightly despite the pressure of the entire room watching her, and calmly said she had been invited there. Mercer burst into mocking laughter and asked who exactly had invited her. Taking a steady breath, she replied that it was the National Academic Excellence Program. The judge repeated the name with exaggerated disbelief, smiling widely as though she had told an unbelievable story, and quiet laughter rippled through the courtroom again. Leaning back in his chair, Mercer mocked the idea further, claiming that programs like that held interviews in schools or universities, not luxury hotel conference suites. Convinced she had invented the story, several spectators nodded or chuckled along with him. Yet Aisha remained still, her expression composed despite the humiliation she had endured throughout the hearing. Mercer then suggested verifying her claim and reached for the phone on his desk. The courtroom watched curiously as he placed the call on speaker. After a few rings, a man answered, identifying himself as Victor Langford. Mercer introduced himself and asked whether any academic scholarship program had been scheduled in the hotel's conference center that week. After a brief pause, Langford replied that there had not been. The conference rooms were reserved only for corporate clients and business events. Murmurs spread across the room again. Mercer muted the phone and turned back toward Aisha with obvious satisfaction, declaring that the call settled the matter and accusing her not only of trespassing, but also of lying in court. Her father shifted tensely on the bench, but stayed silent while the bailiff kept watch, and Mr. Collins avoided eye contact entirely. Yet something about Aisha's demeanor had changed. Instead of looking frightened, she seemed calm, almost strangely calm for someone being accused of dishonesty by a judge. She picked up her notebook again and held it against her chest. Mercer noticed and mocked her for still clinging to it, asking if she was proud of those notes. She simply replied that they were important. He laughed dismissively and told her she was in serious legal trouble, that the courtroom was not some research project. Aisha said nothing more, but briefly glanced toward the back of the room. Most people didn't notice the woman seated there in a sleek charcoal suit who had been quietly observing everything since the hearing began. She occasionally tapped the tablet resting on her lap while watching the exchange with focused attention. During the earlier recess, 2 other well-dressed individuals had slipped into the seats beside her, speaking softly while glancing toward the bench. Mercer, unaware of them, tapped his gavel again and announced that he had heard enough. He claimed Aisha had no legitimate explanation for being in the hotel, and that, combined with the earlier park citation, it showed a pattern of ignoring rules. The courtroom grew silent as everyone waited for his decision. Marcus leaned forward anxiously, while Mr. Collins nervously adjusted his tie. Mercer straightened his robe and spoke about how seriously the court treated trespassing, especially when it involved private establishments with strict security. Aisha stood calmly, gripping her notebook a little tighter, but refusing to look away. What no one in the room realized yet was that the quiet student standing in the center of the courtroom had already set something much larger into motion. The notes inside that small spiral notebook were not random observations, but carefully gathered evidence of patterns she had been documenting for months. Patterns that others outside the courtroom had begun to notice as well. In the back row, the woman in the charcoal suit tapped her tablet again, saving the recording she had just captured. And as Judge Mercer prepared to deliver what he believed would be the final word in the case, he had no idea that the story unfolding in his courtroom was only beginning, and that the very notebook he had mocked moments earlier might soon become the key to exposing everything he believed he could keep hidden.